Good afternoon or good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Van Dongen. I'm an associate with Intuitive and a member of our building envelope team based here in Toronto. I'd like to welcome to the third installment of our Global Perspective series, in which we take an opportunity to come together as an industry to tackle some of the most pressing issues that are affecting us both as an industry and a community through some important dialogue and discussion. In case you have not been a part of the previous sessions, which were focused on transit-oriented development and attainable housing, I would encourage you to check out some really great discussions. We'll include these links to the sessions where you can watch the videos and review key takeaways. As I mentioned, the intent of this series is to engage the community as a whole, and so today is not just about our panelists, but an opportunity for you to be part of the discussion as well. We will endeavor to have a Q&A segment at the end of this session and would encourage you to submit any questions you might have using the Q&A feature. We've also received a number of questions as part of the registration, so thank you for sending those. Where possible, we've tried to incorporate them into the discussion today, and we'll also attempt to address those and any other questions that come up as part of either the Q&A or through our post-event follow-up, so please keep your questions coming. As for this session, today we are turning our focus to building renewal. As an industry, we have made and continue to make great progress with respect to our making our new projects more sustainable. This is important since we know that around 40% of global GHG emissions were generated by buildings, and that this number can be significantly higher in urban settings. We also know, however, that approximately 30% or more of overall emissions are generated by building operations alone, and that nearly 2/3 of buildings that will be occupied and operated by 2040 already exist today. As a result, it stands to reason that our focus in addressing climate change within the built environment should shift to the significant reduction of carbon in existing buildings, those ones which are already on our hands. To that end, building renewal and retrofit presents a major opportunity to address the climate crisis, but also to dramatically improve the quality of our buildings. So in order to explore this in more detail, we are joined by a tremendous group of panelists from across North America today. In the interest of time, we posted their full bios on the event site, which hopefully you've all visited. However, I'd like to briefly introduce them now, so I'll ask them to turn their cameras on. First, we have Karina Jackson, who is the Director of Asset Management with Slate Asset Management, based in Calgary, Alberta. We also have Dan Pizzelli, who is the Director of Sustainability and a Senior Associate with FX Collaborative, based in New York. We have Graham Stewart, who is an architect and urban planner and a principal with ERA Architects here in Toronto. And finally, Salah Imam, who is a building performance analysis lead here at Intuitive in our Vancouver office. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. With that, we'll dive right in. And I'd like to start perhaps with a quick roundtable question for each of the panelists. And to ask you in 30 seconds or less, could each of you tell us what is the biggest challenge you see from your perspective when it comes to building renewal projects? Maybe I'll start with you, Dan.
Sure, hi there. Yeah, so from a technical point of view, I think we know how to do very efficient building retrofits. But the main challenges, as far as I see, are how to do them in cost-effective ways and in ways that address climate justice, which is growing and worthy concern. For example, building renewal itself is usually a really good thing to do in neighborhoods to strengthen them. And deep energy retrofits usually help like overall climate mitigation efforts, which disproportionately affect disadvantaged communities. But digging deeper into material selections and really understanding their impacts, where those materials come from, are they made in ways and in places that affect those communities where they come from, we don't have great information about stuff like that.
That's great. Thank you, Dan. Graham, maybe I'll turn it over to you next.
Sure. Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks for hosting. No, I agree with Dan. I think that we're in a much different place than we were 5 years ago. And that the pilot phase is done. There are exemplar North American projects of what deep retrofit, net zero ready retrofit looks like. And so the barriers to scaling, I think, really are around expectations. I think there's still this notion that a good retrofit is that, the typical change your LED lights, tighten up your boilers and you save 15% carbon. We need to get to 70, 90% should be the baseline. We know we can do it now. So the scaling part is trade readiness, supply chain readiness. And I think seeing that as a major economic driver. And I think we're there. There's a lot of talk about it from the Biden administration, from the Trudeau administration, et cetera. Now it's time to accelerate. And so I think that one of the biggest barriers is really just people understanding, A, it's possible and we've done it, and then B, that we should expect more. People should expect more from their buildings in terms of longevity, comfort, and performance.
That's great. That's encouraging. Thank you. Karina, I'll turn it over to you next.
Sure. I guess to oversimplify it from an owner perspective, it's cost. To complete a project, regardless of the scope, is an expense. And this is especially true in buildings of a certain vintage. With market expectations changing, it can be harder or more costly for an older building to adapt. And it doesn't always mean that cost is a barrier. It just means we have to be a little more thoughtful in terms of the funds that we're spending for maximum impact.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Sala, I'll throw it to you last.
Yeah, I think along the lines with what has been said so far, one of the main barriers has been the difficulty in making a business case for retrofits on energy savings alone, especially in regions with relatively low energy costs. And I think what feeds into that is lack of awareness, if you will, to assess the energy and non-energy benefits that can come from retrofits. Hopefully we can shed the light on some of these issues today.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I appreciate that. And I think there's lots to unpack there, but certainly part of the discussion today. So thank you to each of you. We'll dive in to some more focused questions maybe. And I wanted to start somewhat around that theme. We know that existing buildings present a number of challenges not faced in other projects. So perhaps we can start with a discussion about strategies for planning and sequencing of renewal projects when buildings are either publicly accessible or are partially or fully occupied. That's one of the main challenges with these types of buildings. Graham, I know this has been a focus for some of your recent research work, so maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, maybe some of the table setting to build from some of the other comments is there's a lot of work to do to pivot the economics around better, faster, and cheaper. As regs go up and as the capability makes this better, faster, and cheaper, that's the scaling. But the priming the pump is that there is money at the table now to do deep retrofits for public buildings. And so, the strategy really seems to be, because things are happening, because the economic question has been answered mainly through public support, how do we learn as much as we can in this first generation of deep retrofits, which we're already seeing? So a lot of it is public buildings and nonprofit and affordable housing. So a lot of the work, Chris, that you and I have worked on together or other ones has been there. And in that case, it presents the challenge. You've mentioned buildings that have hundreds of people, hundreds of homes. And then so there really is some great innovation there. There's a right way of doing it and a wrong way of doing it. And I think on the one side, in terms of expectations, and this gets to your point, Sala, about additional benefits, is that we all know you can make a green building that's worse to live in. You could make it airtight and turn the power off and do whatever. Great for carbon, poor for residents. And so the best part is, how do we make buildings more comfortable, more durable, reduce mold risk, reduce drafts, make these, especially in COVID and sheltering in place, increase ventilation, increase those things which may have an energy cost, but make them better places to live and reduce carbon. And we know that's possible because we've done it. Doing that with residents in place. So that's the expectation setting. Where are we getting to and why are we doing this? Really should be comfort first. And then the part gets into planning and sequencing. And so as much as possible, designing with kit from the outside in, as we know, how can you actually, by building an envelope from a robust existing envelope, how do you sequence window chains out so you're entering a unit, 3 or 4 times, not 30 times because of a bad schedule and a bad sequencing. And I think there's and 2 other key points that come to mind. One is the vast array of potential for innovation around supply chain. What is the kit of parts that existing manufacturers could make for doing deep retrofits and residents in place that no one's told them there's a market for, and that's plug and play, ready to install ERVs, HRVs, Windows systems, etc. So huge opportunity there and a lot of innovation already in Europe. The other one is around designing with the contractors. So you're actually designing for sequencing and actually saying, how are we building it? How are we doing it so you're minimizing the amount of disruption and creating accountability? So there's we did publish that piece you mentioned, and there's a great outfit from BC Housing and a standard there, really looking at making contractors partners in customer care and actually thinking of it as a customer care role rather than just people, willy-nilly entering your flat. So lots more we could talk about, but I'll pass it on to the group.
No, that's great. Thank you. And just for the record, we will share some of the documents that Graham is talking about as part of our post-event follow-up, so you can keep an eye out for those. Karina, maybe I'll turn this over to you. I think it's a challenge you've likely faced across your portfolio, so maybe you can share some of your experience with respect to major renewal work.
Graham said it, the idea is quicker is better is cheaper. And that's not always, the case. It's not always feasible to do it that way. So I think from a contractor perspective, doing a project in an occupied building is not ideal. But turning it around a little bit, it can be appealing to a landlord or an owner, because it does mean that there's a steady stream of income throughout the project, which does lend to itself as well. Personally, I also think there's an advantage in terms of public protection, because it's a unique opportunity for the public to get a sense of scope of project and also to kind of be involved in the process, because they may be able to see changes as they're taking place. In terms of planning, there's definitely a number of considerations, and we've definitely experienced this firsthand in the past. Very likely, certain work will have to be completed in off-peak hours, especially if it's noisy or disruptive in any sense. And that can directly impact schedule or cost. You might need additional protection if the public is coming and going in order to maintain access points or easements, and just to ensure that additional level of safety. And there's certainly operational challenges as it relates to completing work in public spaces. For example, if you're renovating a corridor or a pathway that you can't close or you can't shut down, you need to find a way to phase that work or complete it in stages that is the least amount of disruptive, which certainly adds to planning and logistics as well. I think in terms of the more stakeholders there are, whether it's tenants or public or the city, it inevitably adds more opinions, which is a good thing because it's additional perspective, but it can also add to the decision-making process. So it's something I think we need to consider as well. So communication is just absolutely critical in that respect. The better the relationships you have with those stakeholders, the more adaptable you can ultimately be throughout the process.
That's great. That's good insight. And it certainly sounds like engagement of all of the stakeholders is key on these types of projects. I think both of you spoke to that a little bit. So thank you for that. Maybe we'll switch gears a little bit here and jump into another question focused around energy compliance. We know that New York has seen the introduction of North America's most stringent existing buildings compliance policy in Local Law 97. And this appears to be a model that other markets will need to emulate to achieve reduction targets. Dan, with your direct experience, maybe for those that aren't familiar with it, you can perhaps summarize the new policy, but also speak to what trends or responses you're seeing to that since the inception of Local Law 97.
Sure. Yeah, Local Law 97, if you haven't heard about it, it's relatively new law in New York City, which imposes fines for excessive energy use. And part of what makes it so aggressive is that the fines are relatively steep, something like $286 per metric ton of carbon, which could add up to hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for huge buildings. So we're talking real money, and it covers a lot of buildings. So all buildings over 25,000 square feet are kind of subject to it. I mean, there's some exemptions for like churches and other kinds of civic buildings. And then New York City municipal buildings like public schools, they're not covered under it technically, but there's a related law that kind of takes out the fines, but kind of makes them do similar things. And it is going to impact buildings quickly. So there's like 5-year increments where it captures different categories. and it starts in 2024. So the worst 20% performing buildings, the worst 20% of buildings over 25,000 square feet are going to be captured by this in the city starting in 2024. And then 50% more. So then 75% of buildings are going to be covered starting in 2030. So it's a lot of buildings. I mean, the city's really trying to affect change quickly. And, there's a lot of challenges. There's working groups that are trying to figure out how it's actually going to be implemented. But one of the things that's kind of notable is that, right now in New York City, natural gas is more efficient than electric. But in the out years, in 2035 to 2050, it's really incentivizing all electric solutions based on New York State commitments that the grid is going to be clean. So, to be determined if that actually happens. So there's a lot of moving parts in the law, but it really has spurred a lot of thinking about retrofits and how to do them efficiently.
That's great. Thank you. That's a good summary. I think it's certainly a model for the rest of North America to look to. So we anxiously await how the market reception is there for sure. Sala, maybe I'll throw this to you because we've seen the beginnings of some of similar policies in other areas, including Toronto with the net zero existing building strategy. Maybe you can just speak to any comparable examples in Canada and also what we need to do to be able to implement them. There's a lot of ideas around mandatory emissions reporting as a baseline for some of those programs. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, for sure. I think an important takeaway from Local Law 97 or LL 97 here is the shift in focus from energy to carbon. That's a big move. Energy is often used as a proxy for carbon as a performance metric because, for obvious reasons, because it relates directly to cost. Carbon emissions, however, is one step detached from the end user, right? The good news here is the greenhouse gas intensity metric already found its way into the City of Vancouver Zero Emission Building Plan, as well as the Toronto Green Standard, but only for new construction at this point. That said, the Canada Green Building Council produced a roadmap for retrofits responding to the national targets to reduce emissions 30%, if I remember correctly, by 2030. Interestingly enough, the same report also estimates that in Canada, 80% of existing buildings will still be in operation by 2030 and 50% by 2050. So obviously there's a clear mandate to be aggressively retrofitting buildings for low carbon operations. To put that into perspective a little bit, similar to LL 97, the roadmap sets specific limits to greenhouse gas intensity for specific building types. So buildings large buildings in Alberta and Ontario currently emit the most carbon, and so they have the greatest potential for reducing emissions. So I think seeing these action items, if you will, in a future retrofit code or standard, hopefully isn't much of a stretch. And there's also benchmarking is a big one. None of that, I think, even for LL 97 will make sense without benchmarking, without data, right? And LL 97 is part of what makes it successful, I think, in my opinion, is it's a part of a more holistic framework. So owners and building managers for specific building types or asset class, as it's referred to, are already required by law to report their utility usage. And then correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this benchmarking compliance process has been in place for more than a decade now in New York. One of the moves here in Ontario and Vancouver is that we do have similar programs in terms of data and benchmarking, but unfortunately at this point with less data sets. And I think that's the discrepancy, or that's the gap. This is just to say that gathering data is a must in establishing an initiative like LL 97.
Yeah, absolutely. A valuable starting point for sure. So thanks, Sala. Karina, maybe I'll just turn this over to you quickly and for any comment you might have on the ownership perspective of the sort of impending emissions limit and mandatory energy performance disclosure to get your take.
a company, tracking sustainability is a key aspect of value creation for us. So looking at other markets and what's happening there and initiatives that are being rolled out can definitely be helpful for future planning. And at the same time, we do try to be leaders in our respective markets as well. Tracking helps us to see what's coming down the line so we can forecast accordingly for the future. Most of these changes, being discussed are not things you can adapt overnight. So having time to evaluate the requirements, the challenges, the costs, just gives us time to, make sure we're taking a full approach to this, and also secure adequate funding if necessary as well.
That's great, and something we'll come back to for sure as well. So thank you. Maybe we'll move to our next question, and that is that building renewal is among other things an opportunity to address lagging energy efficiency, and Sala touched on this a little bit. I know your work focuses a lot on the optimization of strategies for energy reduction, specifically energy, although carbon shouldn't be forgotten. But maybe you can share some of the big moves we can make in terms of energy efficiency in existing buildings, what we've seen implemented to date, what's been successful, and what we can use as a roadmap going forward.
Yeah, for sure. So when compared with new construction project, the significant difference here is the constraint that comes with existing buildings. Things like heritage component, existing structure limitations, tenants, the carbon intensity of the grid. Lots to say here. Or site shading, as simple as it sounds, it actually is a big one because energy and carbon retrofits often come with an interest in adding renewable capacity, and solar exposure will, obviously have an impact on passive heating and reducing the demand and therefore energy use intensity. So obviously the big moves we analyze will have to work their way around those constraints, depending on the level of ambition as well, in terms of carbon reductions or deep energy retrofits. And in my experience, there's a big advantage in how we quantify operational savings when it comes to retrofit projects. There's this notion of building performance gap, which means that buildings in operation consume more energy than anticipated in the energy model, and we're talking 2 to 5 times more kilowatt hours than predicted, and that can be for many reasons, but the most cited one being occupants' behavior. In retrofit projects, we actually have data. Like I mentioned earlier, benchmarking of historical utility consumption data. And that can be a significant head start to try and bridge, or at least to limit this performance gap. So how it works is that we use these utility patterns to build what we call a baseline model, which is, unlike models for new constructions, is guided and calibrated by actual utility data. Now, what we model and simulate from this point forward, we intentionally call performance analysis or building performance analysis, as opposed to the traditional energy modeling. And the important distinction here is the idea of extending the reach of simulation to actually inform the design process, and that's a big difference in the way we design or retrofit. And computational capacity made these iterative parametric type analysis possible and quick. You have to move at the pace of the design, right, for this to be useful. We then move on to create a full palette of constraints, if you will, of the existing envelope, structure, mechanical, lighting, control system, etc. This really allows us to start developing deliberate analysis schemes to manage our peak loads through trade-offs between building envelope and mechanical system, because it's really critical. Think about it. What we change now in terms of cladding or windows or anything envelope related is only going to be changed once from now to 2050. I mean, like, no pressure, but we really need to maximize the energy upgrade potential at each replacement if we are to achieve a near decarbonized building stock by 2050. Well, at least without redoing work. And everything I just mentioned fits into the actual retrofit action item, but on a more macro scale, the other, I think, essential big moves or industry-wide moves to address energy efficiency in existing buildings can be retro or recommissioning. We do that to optimize systems and equipment for higher performance. This actually should be a near-term fix. And the next one is the switching to a low carbon fuel source. The idea of electrification. This one is a must to realize deep carbon savings. It's just the same difference that we mentioned before between the move from energy to carbon. And obviously on-site renewables like solar. And we want to be strategic here and sort of like just not stick PVs on any building and see what sticks. It's just focus on buildings with large roof to floor space ratios to optimize energy gains.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah, just one last note. Hopefully, I'm not taking much time.
It's comprehensive. That's good.
In case where it's difficult to make the business case, I just wanted to sort of like complement what the group mentioned earlier. For retrofits on energy alone, I think just the understanding and valuation of non-energy benefits can be a game changer. It's something that I don't think is being talked about that much. Things like decreased maintenance costs, resale value. Karina touched on this a little bit. Thermal comfort now and in future climate. The concept of balancing mitigation and adaptation actions, and obviously reductions in embodied emissions compared to building new. Yeah.
That's great. A tremendous summary. So thank you. And I think your last point there is an important one. I think every renewal activity is an opportunity to sort of engage a fulsome analysis of both energy and carbon. And you touched on this earlier. This is not just an energy question, but a carbon one as well. We certainly need to be keenly focused on the reduction of carbon in general, and that expands the lens we look at these projects through. Dan, I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts and maybe your experience with sort of embodied carbon reduction as part of a renewal project.
Sure, yeah. Before embodied carbon, though, I just want to pick up that co-benefit thing. Thermal comfort, acoustics, visual comfort, improved air quality. I mean, these are all things that help make buildings valuable. And I think I just read a study from Cushman & Wakefield here in New York about how through the pandemic here, green buildings have kept their value and kept their occupancy and have better resale value. So there's this clear financial reasons, to push those things and quantify them. But on the topic of embodied carbon, in the last few years, it's become like very clear that the embodied carbon that goes into buildings is actually a bigger short-term problem than operational energy. So if you build a building today, its embodied carbon is X, and it's going to take 10 years or more for the operational carbon to add up to the embodied carbon. So if we're talking about UN projections that we have 10 years or less to deal with, get a handle on climate change, embodied carbon is the bigger issue. And that's part of the reason we're talking about renewal and building retrofits, because the main thing that building industry can do is to reuse buildings, not knock them down and build new. So it's just a very simple concept. And in addition, if you're in retrofits, there's many opportunities to reduce the embodied carbon within retrofits too. Well, first of all, structures and envelopes are, structures are the main embodied carbon issue. Envelopes are the second one. But then within buildings, still something like 40% or 30% of the embodied carbon is interior. And themes like circularity, products that can be disassembled, recyclability, if manufacturers have take-back programs, I mean, all these little things. And Then we get down to like some really difficult ones. Like for me, insulation, I've come across insulation and balancing operational energy versus embodied carbon on a number of projects. In particular, traditional EFIS for exterior or spray foam systems on the interior are both petroleum-based products that are bad from an embodied carbon and other environmental point of view. But they result in thinner assemblies than using mineral wool or other lower embodied carbon issues. So that balance is, that's our new present challenge.
No, that's a very good point, and certainly all things that are near and dear to my heart as an envelope professional. So thanks for that.
I just want to comment
Yeah,
real quick on that, if we do have time, Chris.
Sure.
So just like the whole concept of embodied is relatively new, especially when it comes to implementing it as code. But I just want to throw this out there because maybe I'm a little bit biased to operational. Obviously, it's both of them are important, but although we're theoretically reducing embodied carbon by choosing to retrofit or keep buildings around longer, but I just think that we need to also take a closer look and assess the embodied energy of a material in terms of its lifetime energy benefit it can bring. So this might be in terms of energy it will generate, if it's something related to solar panels, for example, or energy it can save through maybe insulation. So manufacturers here will argue that the improved performance, lower thermal conductivities, for example, and the energy saved through the lifetime of the building make the embodied energy of the product less relevant. It's a fine line, right? But in retrofits, especially spatial and structural constraints imposed by the existing structure can make the use of high or higher embodied energy, but high performance insulation, for example, a sensible compromise in some cases. But that's obviously not always the case. But I just wanted to throw this out there.
I think if I may, that's really, really interesting. And I think that embodied carbon is kind of like net zero was a few years ago, where like everyone's saying it, but no one has a common understanding of what it means. People kind of wave it around like a flag. And I think that so for the Ken Sobel project, which there were some images of that Chris and I worked on, there was a part of our team, we did an extensive embodied carbon analysis, and it was really interesting. And it really gets to what you were, Dan and Salah were saying around just sort of literacy. How do we create a common ground and a common language by talking about carbon? It's apples to apples. You're not worried about your grid efficacy or whatever. It's just like how much carbon. And similarly with embodied carbon, it's really like, what is the project's carbon budget? And if you are removing an existing building, such as in the case of our 18-story, dirty 1960s concrete building, that just gives you that goes to your ledger and says, this is the amount of carbon you have to win back to get back to zero. And then you add on operational, et cetera, et cetera. And we found through that exercise, which we did on behalf of the client, that it would have taken 180 years to win back the lost carbon if you tore down that building and built a new passive house today versus retrofitting it as interfit. And those are just facts, right? So I think that what's interesting about the beginning of mandatory reporting and just building the literacy gap around just carbon budgets on projects. On other ones, if you have a 3-story building and you're building a much larger building, it's a different equation. Yes, you've lost due to the embodied carbon loss of that smaller building, but how many people you're housing for how long, and what is the carbon life cycle over 50 to 100 years? And I think this can become really simplified if we just look at, a piece of land should have a carbon budget. How are you responsible for the pluses and minuses with embodied and operational, starting with reporting, and then to to forward guidance around when will people then be accountable. And then, Karina, as you were saying, from an asset manager perspective, or even like a board shareholder interest perspective, is suddenly those things are quantifiable. That people can put a value to them, both whether it's a market perception of value or whatever. People just want a better product. And as soon as you provide these different quanta to it and you realize, oh, the condo I bought is really dirty, that's not a good look, right? So the more data, the better, the more reporting, and where are we going from here?
That's a great point, Graham. Thank you. I want to move to the next question, which is maybe a step back a little bit, but it kind of speaks to the same theme and the need, obviously, to rapidly decarbonize our building stock, and how we move that work forward. So how do we as design professionals spur the execution of building renewal work, and maybe how you approach these types of projects and how we prepare for the potential of more of this in the future. So Graham, maybe I'll throw this back to you initially.
Because I spoke out of cue, I'll be quick. Well, I think we are really past the pilot stage, which is phenomenal. Like we co-hosted a conference with Passive House Canada a couple of weeks ago, and it was really looking at there's been lots of individual successes coast to coast, and if we combine those, what does that look like? And I know there's a similar conference happening in the U.S. Soon, and I think from a continental perspective, we're way past the pilot stage. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of these types of buildings, and how do we then say, okay, fantastic, which of these do we want to get into replication phase? So in replication phase, it's like you don't have to reinvent the wheel, you don't have to innovate, just do it better, faster, and cheaper. Then it's to say, okay, which of those, and then which are the new things for the next set of the innovation stage? What are the next unicorn projects that are really hard and really complicated that sort of move the bar? But I think we're at a point where we can absolutely go into just replication stage of a lot of the successes we've had. And sort of reiterating some points from before, but there's on the balance on one side, like we all know, if you're working for a university or something like that, and you have a substantial budget, you can really innovate your way out of it. But to deal with the scale of, in an expensive way, let's say, but to deal with the scale of the challenge, we need things that are trade ready, that are simple, that are kind of idiot proof to be able to do this. And so I think as designers, it's both working holistically, obviously with the full team as an integrated team, bringing on constructability concerns and trade concerns from the very earliest processes. And I think that those learnings have already happened. And another one is how do we bring retrofit certification into the trades? So the idea that you're getting, passive house certified trades, you're getting all these things, you're writing to your specs. I think there are different set of issues with existing buildings, and the more contribution that people have from that first generation of projects to then go and train others, so that when you're writing your specs, you're actually like, we want people who've done this before, and we want that guarantee. I think working with the unions and others that this is starting, but there's a lot we can do from here. But I think the first generation of projects have had to deal with to pay for the novelty factor, both pay for it, from the trade side, because it's basically just, you're adding your 20% because someone's never done it before. But also I'd say from the designer side, like it's really just to say, okay, we're sweating this out. Is this going to work? We're past that. So the trend should be that we're seeing more efficiencies. So how do we work together to, as an industry to do that?
That's a really good point. Before I throw to you, Karina, for an owner's perspective, Dan, maybe I'll just, whether you have any feedback from a design professional's perspective, what we can do to spur this type of work.
Sure. Well, on that goal of faster, less expensive, and all that, we've been preoccupied with, how to deal with tenants in place, and specifically working with mega panel manufacturers, like 30 feet by 14 feet, pre-made panels. How do you use systems like that to overclad buildings, along the lines of the European energy sprung system, which, has generated all kinds of buzz and efforts. And I know there's at least 2 or 3 manufacturers out there who are like in kind of late stage R&D on solutions like that, maybe not 30-foot wide, but, more manageable sizes. That are near market for how to do that. So the that next stage of pre-manufactured enclosure overclads is not far away.
Agreed. That's a good point. Karina, maybe any thoughts on from your end on how to unlock the potential of building renewal, be it support you can get from the design community or through other means by legislation or financing?
Yeah, I think from a landlord perspective, understanding the value of building renewal is really important, and that's key for us because ultimately it does benefit our tenants, it benefits communities, the environment, benefits our investors. So having partners who are aligned with the same perspective is very important. If we're speaking the same language, so to speak, it can help us understand how making these changes can result in cost savings or an enhanced product, which is equally as valuable. And so that can help build the case to implement initiatives prior to mandates coming around. One of the practices that we employ is our annual capital planning with a third-party partner. So they not only look at our building systems and how they're performing, but they also look at our current goals, our future goals, and evaluate that against any grants or funding that may be available that year. So some of the projects or initiatives we've been able to take advantage of are Emissions Reduction Alberta, Energy Savings for Business, Natural Resources Canada. So available on both a provincial and a national level as well. And ultimately, our lenders and investors share the same focus as us. So it just creates better alignment overall.
That's great. It certainly seems like the gears are moving from a finance perspective. So it's great to see. I want to come back to you on maybe the next question, which is that I guess building renewal has often historically focused on aesthetic improvement or, life cycle replacement of a very narrow set of building systems. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that shift in some of the market trends you're seeing with respect to more comprehensive retrofits, and how these projects benefit or impact the bottom line.
We've always considered sustainability an important approach to building renewal, but we're also seeing increased demand from tenants in that regard as well now. So leasing is a large component of what we do. So in that sense, energy tools can become marketing tools. In our experience, though it is building class specific, perhaps, tenants are including whole sections on building performance or energy efficiencies in their requests for leasing proposals. And that's coming from a place of companies developing their own energy or green initiatives and policies, and they're really looking for a landlord that aligns to that. So, we naturally meet a high set of standards. So we've actually gone so far as to create a package that sort of details what we're doing for prospective tenants to answer those frequently asked questions that we're seeing more and more now. So that's definitely a trend that I see in future years. I know there was a question on retrofits and net leases. I don't know if we wanted to jump into that now or come back to it later, but it kind of falls along the same lines.
Yeah, maybe we'll come back to that. I think it was a good question that came in from one of our registrants. So we'll definitely make time for that. Graham, I think one of the things Karina touched on is obviously the benefit to tenants, and that extends to occupants of residential buildings as well. We know that those go beyond direct energy reductions, obviously, and there are many sort of co-advantages of these. Maybe you can touch on some of the co-benefits and successes you've seen through building renewal work to date.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think COVID has in so many ways put daylight on this as we all stayed in our homes for so long. And there was a real equity piece there. And Dan, as you mentioned, with climate justice and other pieces, that some people's homes were just in a much better place to shelter in place for the last 18 months than others. And what we found in a lot of the work that we've done is that, while some of these flats are large and have many benefits and people like them, there are some pretty major liabilities. And some of those relate around just addressing climate extremes and how that's done. We've all heard both in New York and Toronto and across North America about overheating deaths and extreme weather events in the summer. Those will only get worse as the climate continues to change. So this sort of gets back to the idea of what are our expectations? What is a dwelling? What in our homes, what should we expect? And I think that conversation is changing, especially around, let's say, ventilation. Like everyone saw ventilation as a tax at the end of a project. And now it's front and center. What is the ventilation strategy? Both, Karina, probably for some of your office tenants who are saying, can I open my window? So suddenly there's a whole new paradigm around ventilation, a whole new paradigm around, comfort and extreme weather conditions. And when you look at a standard like Passive House, and not to say that, every building in the world should be Passive House, but one of the things we quite like about that standard and Entuitive is that it's comfort driven in that things like the center of glass, you have to maintain above a certain temperature. Even in the coldest day in February, you have to be able to put your hand on that center of glass and it feels warm and comfortable. And that just has to do with the quality of that window. Where we're too accustomed to putting your hand on the center of glass and it's 2 degrees Celsius and covered in condensation, and people are just, feeling uncomfortable. So I think that across the board, our expectations of what is the quality we expect from our housing. And then thankfully that has massive co-benefits and also being much more carbon efficient buildings. And so in the retrofit context, there are so many co-benefits. And I think as literacy expands and people realize, the flat that I've been living in really is base standard. And how do we raise those? There's a whole other set of discussions which we can get into as a group around what is the most efficacious way to bring capital then to these projects, especially if it's not about raising rents. The capital has to come from somewhere, and there's a whole discussion there. But I think there's certainly a path forward.
That's great. Thank you. And certainly, building resilience is another item that is absolutely a co-benefit of these types of projects as well. I wanted to go back, Sala, maybe to a point you made earlier as a market trend. I think the CAGBC report you talked about references kind of an outline for the quantity of buildings that will need to fuel switch as part of this, and using that as a solution for carbon reduction. And maybe you can touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I think of this more as a constraint from like a project team perspective than it is a trend. It's just completely beyond the project team control. It's just the carbon intensity of the grid, or of the regional or local electrical grid. What's currently being thought of as mainstream sustainability, which is evaluating a building's energy performance, alone actually fails to consider how carbon emissions vary widely between electricity grids across the country and between fuels used on site as well. So generally in Canada, actually, a big percentage of electricity is actually sourced from low carbon sources, but we still have a relatively a large carbon footprint. And the problem is that we disproportionately rely on fossil fuel to heat our buildings. And that is just a big one. That's a massive part of the problem. The emission profiles, of buildings in places like Ontario and here in BC are dominated by emissions from natural gas. But I have to say that we are slowly moving to a more comprehensive change. I'd say the carbon intensity of most provincial electricity grids will decrease by 2030. Here, the grids with the highest carbon intensity will see significant improvements as we transition away from coal specifically. So, as the carbon intensity of the electrical grids decreases, the greenhouse gas reduction benefit from electrification will rise, right? So, and now it's making even more sense to transition away from reliance on fossil fuels to heat our buildings. But we have to be strategic about this in the sense of having an understanding of how the local grid is fueled and operated today, as well as how it will likely shift between now and 2050. So we can actually inform the staging of our energy and carbon retrofit. So in locations with a carbon intensive grid, reductions in operational energy use now and additional renewable electrical generation should be immediate. But in locations where there is a relatively clean electrical grid, then finding ways to eliminate using fossil fuel for space and water heat take priority.
Right. Dan, maybe I don't know whether you want to speak to the local experience south of the border as well, or any other market trends that you're seeing. You're on mute, Dan.
Yeah, there you go. There's a proposed gas ban here in New York. I just attended a rally for it the other day. American Institute of Architects in New York is behind it, and others. And it's really interesting and enticing. And actually, even Columbia University just announced that they're not going to build any new buildings with gas hookups. That sounds great, but I can't help but I know that there's challenges. So like, is it even possible to do that? And, there's 4 things specifically I just need to mention. Like one of them is just domestic hot water. Okay, heat pump water heaters exist. Are there enough products at scale and competition in the marketplace to satisfy the need? Period. Clothes dryers. Do heat pump clothes dryers dry clothes enough to satisfy people? Like, yeah. Cooking. Induction cooking. I actually haven't used one myself, but I understand that they're great. Chefs love them. That should not be an issue, and it's just a perception problem. But then, more importantly, peak heating, in super cold climates, like the heat pumps, VRFs, do they like really take care of those peak loads, or do you really actually need gas or some kind of backup system to deal with the peak conditions? So like a ban would prevent you from doing that, right? And then the other thing is power outages. So if there's, power outages for different reasons, storms, transformers blow up, so what happens then? So, that's another reason to focus on like, great envelopes where buildings keep their temperature for a longer time, but also things like storage. How do you store energy? Is it batteries? Is it thermal storage? There's an issue there about power outages. You need some kind of backup systems. So there's just a few concerns about this proposed gas ban. I mean, great thing, technical things that are probably going to get solved, but some current challenges.
No, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, it certainly speaks to the what Sala talked about, which is keeping that in mind as we make these design decisions at the major intervention points. So I'm mindful of the time here, and I do want to get to some of the questions that we have got to, but maybe before I do that, I'll just revisit the first question I asked each of you, and maybe spin that a little bit. I think it's clear we have our work cut out for us when it comes to the need for retrofit of a significant number of buildings, obviously. And so I wanted to ask, where do we go from here as an industry? What's the biggest opportunity you see, as a professional in this industry, and what's next for us in the realm of building renewal? Maybe I'll start with you, Sala.
Yeah, sure. I see a lot of value and opportunity in having performance-based retrofit codes in place, specifically for larger buildings, at the very least. And if the goal of retrofits is reducing carbon emissions, and it really should, we have to think beyond energy in our retrofit, or even new construction codes, actually, and include terms like total carbon footprint, carbon performance, obviously in addition to energy performance or energy use intensity. And we can also aggregate retrofit projects. We're seeing that already in some of the RFPs out there. So instead of approaching every retrofit as an individual project, we aggregate energy services contracts for several buildings with similar setup or characteristics. I think this can help create a business case, to Karina's point, or justify investments in research and development, which is obviously essential for longer term resilience of retrofit projects.
Absolutely agree. Karina, maybe I'll go to you next.
Sure. I think, as it relates to Calgary specifically, our market has really spurred some out of the box thinking as landlords are having to challenge themselves in order to attract and retain new tenants. So there's some really interesting discussion going on right now about, and actually initiatives as well, about redevelopment or conversion to residential and other uses like that. And to a smaller scale, we're seeing amenities being built in B and C class assets that may not have had them before. Facade replacements are happening, and other projects really designed to set each building apart. So although that enhances the value in terms of the tenant perspective, it's also an opportunity for us to increase our energy standards. So I think overall it'll just make our buildings better for years to come.
That's a great point. Innovation coming from some challenges for sure. So Graham, maybe I'll throw to you.
Sure. I mean, just building on what everyone said, which is this has been a fabulous discussion and we could go on and on. I would say, the things that come to my mind are set targets and meet them. And so right now, at least in the Canadian context, there's some phenomenally ambitious targets, including the federal government saying they want to retrofit 240,000 housing units in the next 10 years. And they've got $15 billion, behind it. Spend that money, meet those targets, set annual targets and start with 10 buildings and the next year 20, next year 50. I think we've shown that it's it's absolutely possible. We've gotten over that the first perception gaps. Now it's set targets and meet them. And on the other side of that, I would say is that, as a designer and a practitioner, I think we all know you and Karina as a client, you start, you build a team, you set an objective, you could spend 3 years designing, fundraising, getting board approval, and then doing it. The last person to find out is the actual construction market. You go to tender, you go to the construction industry, and they may be ready, they may be not. And often you're paying for a novelty premium. So how do we tell the story that we are going to be, retrofitting X number of buildings over the next 5 years? That's this many windows. We need this many heat pumps. We need this many, whatever. Dan, to your position, obviously your quandary, the big study, is it even possible to go gas free in New York City? But if you were, what does that mean in terms of kit, and who's designing that kit, and how, and what are the pathways to spur industry to do the R&D to get it? So I think there's that massive industry piece. How do we get the products we need? What are the products we need? What are the gaps? How do we get them, and at what price point? And it's no different than, electric cars or Apple computers or whatever, to bring that level of innovation to the construction retrofit supply chain.
Thanks, Graham. Great points. Dan, finish with you.
Real quick. Well, I have a concern that if the grid goes all electric, that people aren't going to care anymore about how much of that clean energy that they use. So I think right now, while we are still relying on gas, making normal those things that are currently abnormal, like, at one point single glazing was the thing and double glazing was crazy. Now triple glazing is crazy. Like, it shouldn't be. It should be normal. Like, let's make that normal. Let's make, a super focus on air tightness normal. Let's make, a couple extra inches of insulation normal. Like, now's a great moment to just get those things to be pervasive and normal.
Yeah, excellent point. We are up against the clock, unfortunately, and as Graham says, we could continue this conversation for hours, and we certainly hope to do so at some point. But maybe we'll leave it there for now. I think we have got some questions come through the Q&A, and I think we'll try to address those through some of the post-event communication. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll reach out to our panelists for their feedback on those as well. I'd like to thank each of the panelists for being here today and sharing their insights. I think we've heard some really valuable ideas about the need and opportunity to drive meaningful renewal. And as well as some really tangible strategies for doing just that. I'd like to thank everybody also who joined us. It's great to see you here. We hope that you will come back and join us as part of our continuing series. Our next event and the last one for 2021 is planned for November, and will be a discussion around master planning and delivering on sustainability from the earliest stages of development. It promises to be a great event. So stay tuned later this month for details on how to register there. And lastly, if you have an idea for an event topic or speaker, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to communications@intuitive.com with your ideas, or reach out directly to us. We look forward to receiving them. With that, thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Excellent.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks all.